The notorious conman Loizos Michaels talked people into giving him over $3 million, but he couldn't convince the parole board to let him out of jail. Michaels was sentenced to 8 years in jail after being found guilty of 30 fraud charges back in 2012. He told the parole board he was sorry for what he'd done, but in a decision released today, the board concluded Michaels was deceitful and manipulative. Our court reporter Edward Gay covered the trial back at the time. He was with the New Zealand Herald then. He's been looking at the parole board decision for us. He's now at RNZ, and I asked him who Michaels conned.
He conned a lot of people, including these Christchurch casino executives. Now, he convinced them somehow that he was part of a takeover bid for Auckland's Sky City Casino, that he was connected to this Chinese family that were about to do this huge takeover in Auckland. He promised the chief executive of Christchurch Casino, Stephen Littleton, a salary of $1 million. It started off, I think, at $1 million, but it ended up at over $12 million. Now, he also insisted that Mr. Littleton actually show some commitment and put some of his own money into this takeover bid, and Mr. Littleton set about doing that, and in the end Mr. Michaels took over $1 million off Mr. Littleton. He was flashing cash around. Everyone believed Michaels was the real deal. Eventually though, Mr. Littleton approached his friend, the National Party president and rich lister Peter Goodfellow, and asked him to get involved as well. Now, Mr. Goodfellow lent money to Mr. Littleton, but at this sort of restaurant meeting down in the viaduct, Mr. Goodfellow became suspicious, and he employed a private investigator to look into Loizos Michaels' past, and he basically uncovered the fact that Michaels was a fraudster. Michaels also had tried to con the All Black, or at least try and get involved with the All Black great Jonah Lomu, and he promised Lomu $15 million to sort of head this international kickboxing competition. Now, Lomu actually walked away. He didn't get involved. When nothing sort of came to fruition, Lomu just walked, and that was the end of his involvement with Michaels. The sentencing judge, at the end of this trial at the Auckland District Court, the sentencing judge, Christopher Field, described Michaels as a predator who was motivated by naked greed.
What a remarkable case. 8 years, which is a long time for this kind of fraud, isn't it? So the book was thrown at him. Michaels, of course, consistent with his behaviour thus far, displayed no remorse whatsoever and blamed his victims, right?
He maintained his innocence up until only 2 years ago, but he blamed everyone else. He even went so far as to say that he was somehow a victim of a serious fraud office conspiracy. Look, he maintained his innocence. He took his case to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal described his case as a sustained, ever-developing con. And yet, he's only just changed his story 2 years ago to the parole board.
Yes, as he's approaching the parole board.
That's
and
right.
So I'm not going to be cynical on national radio. I'm just going to ask you, what was the parole board's response to this change of heart and the sense that this is a reformed character?
Well, the parole board saw this change of heart 2 years ago. They described it, well, they said they didn't place much weight at all on his remorse. They said there was no fundamental change in his attitude. And 2 years on, the board hasn't actually changed its view on that. There are letters of support for Michaels, apparently.
Did he write them himself?
Well,
Sorry, I shouldn't make light of this.
We don't know who wrote them. The board's decision, as is their custom, they haven't named who. They haven't said who's written these. They've withheld the names of Mr. Michaels' support people. And that's what they always do, and there's not much detail in terms of how far that support goes or where that support comes from. Yeah, we just don't know. But
they're not persuasive, obviously. Well, not enough to get him parole.
The board says Michaels is still a risk to the community. The board found that he's deceitful. They said he's manipulative. They described him as a recidivist confidence trickster, and he continued to pose a risk, not just in New Zealand, but in Australia, where he also has convictions. Incidentally, once he gets out of prison, he's going to be deported back to Australia. And it said that Michael still has very little understanding of his risk factors, doesn't have a strong release plan, and he's due back before the board in March next year.
Edward Gay, our court reporter, talking to us earlier.